Welcome, everybody. I'm Ashish Kaushal, founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build belonging in the workplace, and CEO of a staffing firm called Hire Talent that focuses on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Today is March 7th, marks 2 months since the death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of police officers. Today we have our special guest, Dr. LaNail Plummer, CEO of Onyx Therapy Group, here to talk about what Tyre Nichols' killing says about the misuse of power, how the misuse of power shows up across other institutions such as the workplace, and ways to prevent the ongoing misuse of power. Welcome.
Hey, Ashish, how are you?
Good. How are you, my friend? And then the last thing I want to announce is that she's joining our board of advisors. So we're really excited about that as well.
I'm so excited. You guys know how much I love Consciously Unbiased. So super excited to be able to join in a more formal way as well.
Definitely. We're humbled for that. What was your initial reaction when you heard about Tyre Nichols' death?
Oh my God. I don't know if I calculated like my initial reaction. I know that my first emotion was extreme sadness. I remember getting emotional and starting to cry for a number of reasons, right? Like, I think one of the elements about me being a therapist is that I always stay in tune and in touch with my emotions, because that is also how I connect with my clients, right? So I have to be authentic in all spaces. So I let my emotions come out as they need to. And I remember just being sad and in shock and confused and upset in so many different ways. And then I started to think about, oh my gosh, this is about to be an interesting conversation for the next couple of weeks and maybe even the next year, because these particular police officers are Black. And historically, we've been seeing and talking about white police officers killing Black people. And it has a different layer and element to it because these particular police officers are Black. And so I remember having just a lot of different feelings and responses and emotions and reactions at once. And then soon after, going to my son and having a conversation with him about what that means. And then later, my daughter. Yeah.
No, definitely. And, we'll go into the next question in a minute. You brought up a point that I actually just remembered for myself. So right after 9/11, about a year later, I was taking a client to Miami, and funny enough, I'm at a conference now, and so that kind of connects the dots. But I was flying back to New York on Monday morning, and as we were descending on LaGuardia, a woman 2 rows behind me said, "America's the devil, we're all going to die." And then she screamed it, and then people got up and they got scared, and they jumped on her, and we tackled her and stuff like that. And she was a white woman with brown hair, so she doesn't look normal. And so I didn't really think I just thought she was having a weird moment in her head or whatever. Maybe she got too much sun, but I had never thought for a second that she was going to like mess up the plane or put us in danger. But if she had looked like me, I 100% would have been scared, right? And so we were taught in the media to almost become racist against ourselves on some level, right? And so it's perspective. Yeah. So when you hear about a Black police officer killing a Black person, you can make it a general thing, but I think it's more of a systemic thing of how are we actually choosing our police officers. It's not about race in this case. It's more about the fact that we can't go with that narrative. We have to fix the problem, the fundamental part of it. So speaking of that, systems themselves can be built on racism, as policing in America can illustrate. Can you share a top-line view about the history of policing in our country and how we got here?
Yeah. I had the privilege of going to Howard University for undergrad and for my graduate degree as well. And so with it being an HBCU, you can imagine that a lot of our education was traditional education that people were learning in different universities and at different schools. But we also were consistently Black history was consistently woven into our education experiences. My undergraduate degree was in justice, administration of justice, as a matter of fact. And back in the day, I wanted to be a forensic psychologist. So I had a really interesting program where it focused on this integration of psychology and criminology. And so while I was at Howard, and even now, I spend time thinking about what policing actually looks like in this country. So historically, we know that policing in the European countries were largely rooted on being a part of the neighborhood and just kind of having management over the neighborhood, right? Like having understanding and eyes, paying attention to what's happening in that particular neighborhood. Looks similar now, right? Where we have like city police officers and county police officers, because the idea is that they're part of the community. But here in the United States, policing is historically different because there was the element of slavery that was brought into the mix. So when we had our Black enslaved folks who were running away and leaving plantations because they wanted freedom, we saw the incorporation of policing and policing tactics to bring them back, take them back to their plantations. So policing in the United States wasn't just a matter of governing particular neighborhoods or managing particular neighborhoods. It was a matter of returning what somebody thought was stolen or returning what somebody thought was being left. And so there was always this element of violence in policing in the United States versus in other countries. In other countries, you see people walking around with like a baton, or the police officers have like tasers, or they may have like, spray and things like that. But in our country, police officers have guns, and they've always had guns. And even when you look at them, a century, 2 centuries ago, and you see police officers, they're on horses with guns. It was always a matter of physical force and violence, which is part of what power is. Power is this idea around management, but when people can't manage in social ways, then they manage by force, right? And we see the development of that in different industries, not just in policing, but also in our education systems, in our companies, in our jobs, in our management. We see it in HR and things like that also. But the history of policing in the United States was also rooted on violence. And it was rooted on thinking that people, particularly Black people, were criminals. That is how the system started in the United States. White people were police officers, Black people were criminals. Then when you add in these other elements like overseers on plantations, and then you start adding in the diversity of police forcing, those folks still have to believe in and abide by white supremacy, right, in order to be successful in their own jobs. And so that's where we see Black police officers, like those who killed Tyre Nichols, killing other Black people. And it's not just like, oh, here's Black on Black violence and what people have been talking about inappropriately for years. It's also about how these Black police officers fed into this white supremacy perspective, despite their race, despite their own history. And subsequently, it also led to the death of Tyre Nichols. They were only able to do that because they were police officers at that time. But there's also other things that are woven into that too, because we remember that one of the police officers and Tyre Nichols had a woman in common that they had dated and been with. And so there's that patriarchal, element that's present there too, that is rooted in power as well. So we see all of these added layers as it pertains to Tyre Nichols' death.
No, absolutely. And I think there's probably also a level of sort of peer pressure to fit in, right, and establish yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Probably it's underlying too with some of this, but.
Well, there's testing, right? Like, and people do it all the time. Like, are you really down for the cause? Do you really understand what we're about? Can you ride out with me? Can we do these things together? And that's probably what also happened to some of the other police officers that were there and part of that murder. I imagine that all of them didn't wake up that morning like, we're going to go get somebody today and we're going to kill them. But like you said, that peer pressure. And policing and paramilitary is kind of designed like that, like your battle buddies. You're willing to ride along with whoever you're assigned with, because that's the way the system is designed.
Yeah. I also think, I think I don't want to go too far into the police part, because I definitely want to tie this back to the workplace. But I honestly think like the whole defund the police thing wasn't a great campaign. I think we should have it's the only government agency that's commerce based, right? Like they have to hit a certain amount of tickets, right, as the cops and stuff like that. And so I think we need to fund them to a point where that's not part of their their goals, right? Because compensation drives behavior. And so if you're forced to get X amount of tickets, you're of course going to pull people over late at night and do things that turn into bad situations. The second thing is, I think unions are supposed to be there to protect the police force, but not give it immunity, right? And so I think they should have accountability. Like, I'm not going to just let you do anything and just cover your back for that. Like, if you do something bad, you're going to be held accountable and not be protected by us. And so I think their charter has to change, right? Because the whole point of a union is to protect those that are not protected, right?
Right. And what's interesting about that is that in some of the other more recent or historical murders that we've seen at the hands of police, we see that a lot of these police officers were protected by their union or protected by their leaders. And in this particular case, we saw something different where their supervisor, a Black woman, was like, oh, no, we're not about to do this, right? Like immediate action. And as she mentioned it in one of the interviews, she saw the videos and there was nothing that they were wrong. And there was no way that she said that she was going to argue against the fact that they were wrong, where she could have protected them or she could have allowed the union to protect them, but she didn't, right? And I think to me, that is what good policing is about. Now, she has a history that everybody doesn't necessarily respect. She has some experiences that she had down in Georgia that caused some controversy there. But when it showed up in this particular case, she was definitely about making sure that justice was swift and that it was served and it was proper. And I think that that's what we need. So we're looking at two different elements of power, right? Because she had power and these police officers had power. And the reactions were totally different, right? So in one case, the police officers with power killed somebody, and then in another case of power, justice was absolutely initiated. And ideally, we'll see that it is fully rendered and served as well.
Yeah. And then I think the third thing that they need to do is change the test to actually get admitted into being a police officer, right? Like, I'm afraid of blood. I don't like to see it. So I self-selected myself out of being a doctor, right? Because I can't handle it. So if you think about, the job is filled with anxiety, right? And so if you as an individual, and we're going to go into your therapy part here basically, but if you have, I think we should test for empathy in our tests as a police officer. And I think you should test for secure attachment. Because if you don't have secure attachment, then you have a propensity to be anxious and nervous. And if you're in a situation where there's guns involved and you're anxious and nervous, you're going to pull the trigger.
Right? Ashish, you're talking my language. You're talking about secure attachment and all that kind of stuff. I love it. I love it. Okay. So secure attachment is beautiful, right? And I do believe that police officers need to have secure attachment. I think that leaders need to have secure attachment. People with power need to have secure attachment. But the reality is most people don't, right? And so then there's other things that we need to be considering as well in that regard. There should absolutely be psychological testing for police officers, but not just police officers, for anybody that has that kind of power, because you're over people, right? Like, you have the power of life and death. And in our companies and corporations and even our small businesses, people have the power over somebody's livelihood. They have the power over somebody's goals, over somebody's future. They have the power over, generational wealth or education access. And because they have that power, they need to know how to manage it properly. And again, like I mentioned a second ago, a lot of folks, power is really about getting people to do certain things. It's really connected to influence, right? Yeah. But that is rooted in management. And if people are not skilled and properly trained in management, the social psychology, social learning, connections, relationship, like you mentioned, attachment, secure attachment from a psychological perspective, then force enters into the situation. And we see that in our companies where people will misuse their power. They'll force people, they'll harass people, they'll intimidate people as a way of getting control and compliance. And they think that the control and compliance is management, but that's a negative, harsh element of management, as opposed to just using social skills and emotional intelligence like empathy to understand how power is supposed to be properly used.
Yeah. I mean, and I always say the person you are at home is the person you bring to work. And so people say I'm different at work versus different at home. It's not true. Right. And so your force and power and your aggressiveness is stemmed in your insecurity. Right. And that's why you're doing it, because you're afraid to be found out or something. And so I really think it's important that, I mean, based on your research, what ways in what ways does the incident illustrate the misuse of power? Like, can you give us examples of how you see it happen in the workplace?
Oh man. I think so many examples. Like I have examples, research-based examples, personal-based examples as well. But I will say one of the things that I want to start, because you mentioned home and the misuse of power at home. I think another major element in a child's first engagement with power outside the home is the education system. And we see a misuse of power in the education system too, especially when we think about this phenomenon of the pre-K to prison pipeline. Remember, power is about management, right? And it's about understanding folks and knowing how to motivate, knowing how to influence, knowing how to get them to do the things that you need them to do. Power in itself is not bad. It's not a negative thing. It's only bad when we use it improperly. So in the education system, if we have teachers or student leaders, administrators who don't necessarily know how to manage students, then they'll call those students bad students. If they don't understand the dynamics of what's going on with a student, if they don't understand the psychology of child development, they'll call those students bad students. And then we start the process of special education. Now, special education in itself is not bad. It's actually something that's really powerful and beautiful, right? But if it's used improperly, then we have children who are in special education who should not be in special education. And subsequently, they are ostracized. They're set apart in negative ways. They're not getting access to particular education that they need, or they're being mislabeled, like emotionally disturbed. They have improper diagnoses. And what we see with students who get into that particular system is that they tend to move forward and get passed on to another institution or another system, which is the justice system. So we see this, what is called the pre-K to prison pipeline, started with the misuse of power in education with a simple teacher or a couple different administrators. And so it could start this entire process where we have people that are in prison because they were misdiagnosed, or because somebody didn't understand them, or because somebody misused their power and didn't really consider who they were. That's one example, right? Education.
And you're subconsciously programming that child to be what you're saying they are.
Yeah, you're saying you don't belong. Yeah. You're constantly, and it's not like every school does a great job with special education. In fact, there's many schools that don't. And I love the work we get to do at Onyx, because we are often called in to reevaluate students, or we're often called in to provide the direct emotional support for students so that they don't go into that pre-K to prison pipeline, right? So a school from across the nation will call us and be like, hey, can you come in and do this particular work? Evaluate, see if we're doing this right, or did we make some mistakes? And absolutely, I go in and I do it. But that's because they are aware of that they have this influence over a person's future and the generations that'll come behind them. Yeah. One bad use of power can affect many generations. One thing that happens very shortly. I talk to my clients, and I know you asked for an example. You're like, there go Dr. Plummer just talking. But one of the things about how misuse of power works is I give examples to my clients, either private practice clients or corporate clients, around you can break a bone in seconds. Fall, break a bone, right? The amount of time that it takes for healing is so much longer. So you break a bone and then you have to go to the hospital. That's time. You have to get it evaluated. You have to get the x-rays. You may have to get surgery. You have to wear a cast. You have to keep it elevated. It changes your life. It changes your lifestyle. And that could be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And then you can still have folks. I have a friend of mine who broke her leg a couple years ago, who still can't use her leg the way that she wanted to or needed to. One short second that can create a broken bone could have effects for months, for years, for decades to come, right?
Mhm.
That's how the misuse of power works too. One bad mistake can affect can affect that person and the next generation after them and the next generation after them. It could have an effect where it causes the community around them to have distrust, where it causes distrust in a particular organization or a team. It can have a ripple effect. One misuse of power, which is why this talk today is so important, because people can't make those mistakes. You don't make simple mistakes with misusing power, because the effect is so strong and so long and affects so many different people.
So
Go ahead. Sorry, Ashish.
in terms of how do you define power in the workplace?
Well, I define power in the way that we as mental health people define power, which is, again, this ability to get people to do things.
Mhm.
So it's, ability to get things done through other people. It also sounds like influence, except influence could mean I am doing something and somebody does something similar to me, right? Or I motivate them to get something done. Where power is, I have this vision, but I need other people to do it. Right. And so what is my ability to get other people to complete task or to feel into my emotions or whatever the case may be? Keep in mind that power is generally an experience, but it's rooted in the emotion, and the emotion is usually desire. So what is the person's desire? What is it that they're trying to get done? It also connects to motivation, which is also an emotion that is rooted in movement. Motivation is rooted in the word motus, which means to move.
Mhm.
So this idea is that power is about a person's ability to get other people to get things done based off of their own desire and how they motivate people to get what they need to get done. Again, many people can do that through understanding social psychology. But when people lack social psychology and they lack emotional intelligence, they subsequently use force, such as intimidation, which is why we see people going back to police officers. They'll hold their gun. They won't necessarily pull it yet, but they want to remind you that they have this weapon that's here, right?
Yeah.
At work, they'll call in somebody to come in and be a part of the process and create bullying and things like that, or intimidation or harassment. And we see that in entertainment with all these people who have been called out on the ways that they've misused their power in leading companies and choosing models and choosing actresses. And subsequently, they have forced people into sexual positions and sexual acts and silence them and things like that. So we see it in education, we see it in entertainment, we see it in companies, we see it in corporations, we see it at universities. Power is a part of social dynamics. The misuse of power is because people don't know how to actually manage and control folks. So instead they use intimidation and they use force to try to control.
So, I mean, you made me think about some things there. And so tell me if I'm wrong here, but the one light bulb that came into my head was, there's all these books about management. So you become a manager, right, when I promote you. And then we spend all this money on training managers how to be good managers. And the training highly is focused on how do you get the best out of your team and how do you manipulate them in a way that makes them productive. But it doesn't work. But if it doesn't work, if you don't actually figure out what makes your drivers work, right? So as a manager, we're so disconnected with who we are, and then we don't know we're subconsciously doing some crazy stuff to abuse power because we don't understand ourselves. And I think the best way to become a good manager is actually to put them to training to get them to understand themselves before they actually can manage other people.
Yeah,
that's happening.
So many thoughts there. So in addition to being the CEO at Onyx, if I don't do enough, right, I'm also faculty at Johns Hopkins University. And so there I get to study what that looks like and what the development of self-awareness looks like. And just yesterday, I was talking to my students about how we increase awareness, what kind of factors allow us to have awareness. And one of the main elements of that is therapy, of course, because therapists are trained in helping folks increase awareness. But because of that lack of awareness, like you said, people don't understand themselves and they don't understand what they need. This is also how it connects to the misuse of power. because that one element of power also includes getting people to do things that you can't do for yourself or won't do for yourself in that moment. A lot of these people are walking around with emotional deficits and they need validation. And because they don't know how to validate themselves, or they don't know how to affirm themselves, because we expect everything to be external, because they don't know how to do it themselves, they use people to make them feel better, right? You ever see those people and you're like, they called it like the Napoleon complex and stuff like that. Like you just feel insecure. So now you want to control other people so that you feel in control again, or you feel secure again. That's another misuse of power. And we see that in cases all the time where somebody doesn't feel good about themselves, so they make somebody else feel bad, right? Like if I have the power to make you feel bad, then it must mean that I am good at something, even if that something is manipulating you, even if that something is making you think that you should treat me a particular kind of way. Again, power in itself is not a bad thing, right? Power in itself is actually a beautiful thing. It could be very much part of community. It could be very much part of a shared experience. It's when we lack social understanding and responsibility and emotional intelligence, and subsequently we use manipulation and intimidation and force to still get something done, even if that something is validating ourselves, because we don't know how to validate ourselves, because we're not even aware fully of all the things that we want and need.
No, absolutely. It's I did this little exercise with some people, some of the leaders that I know and that I have in our organization. There's a website called Very Well Mind, and I have new leaders write about their 20 common defense mechanisms and how they work, right? And I don't ask them to show it to me. I'm like, just write 2 pages on each piece and then shred it. But at least it makes them understand how they function. If they understand how they function, they can understand how their defense mechanisms prevent them from being good leaders. And so I think that's something that people should actually do if they're open to it.
Yeah. You brought up another good point, Ashish. I talk to folks sometimes and they're like, oh, Dr. Plummer, how did you become a leader? Yada, yada, yada. Some of it was just environmental, right? Like that is just what my purpose is and what was required of me. And while I did not have the very best experience in being in the United States Army, and I think that's because it is an institution and it doesn't allow for individuality, and I'm a Black woman and the military wasn't designed for me, right? And so that became apparent. But one of the things that the military and my enlisted soldiers taught me was around like just pure leadership and understanding, right? And I remember even some of my officers at the time making us go through leadership training, making us go through scenarios, putting us in situations, and we didn't even know that it was a test, where we are have to think about other people, where we have to think about missions and visions at the same time of understanding soldiers. I think our mission at the time, our slogan at the time was mission first, people always. So we had to think about both at the same time. And I think that sometimes people get caught up either focusing just on mission and they forget the whole element of people and human. And subsequently, they don't necessarily know how to use social responsibility and social psychology to motivate these people to align with the mission. And because of that, then we see force. And in that force and intimidation, we have all these other issues that happen. And there's a ripple effect to that when we talk about it from corporations, right? If one manager misuses power and that victim goes to HR, then we have a whole HR issue that's popping up too because of one misuse of power. And then we spend so much time on human relations and so much time on fixing something that we never actually get to sit in on the mission that we wanted and go forth in those ways. So because people get afraid in those ways, they use intimidation instead of sitting back and learning emotional intelligence, and instead of sitting back and creating their own self-awareness. How do they communicate? How do we communicate? What are our triggers? What are our sensitive spots? What's our cycle of emotions, right? Because we can't take emotions out of work. People like to think that we can, but we can't. But there's 7 steps on a cycle of emotions. Where do we fit in oftentimes in these situations? When do we get upset and we lean into intimidation as opposed to leaning in to social psychology and responsibility? There's a lot that we can learn in leadership, a lot that we can learn with power as it connects to social responsibility.
So what are some lessons that we can learn from in terms of how other institutions such as workplaces and HR can better handle the response to misuse of power?
Well, I think you brought up something major, Ashish, which is why I love talking to you, right? Because you're so smart and we always have these good conversations. I just looked at the time, like 30 minutes has passed. We're getting here talking. That's what you and I do, right? We just get to talking. I think one of the major things that you brought up, and it seems like one of our comments highlighted that as well in terms of self-awareness. Folks need to be aware of who they are. Again, what motivates them, what triggers them, where their sensitive spots are, what their security is, what their communication styles are. And from a therapeutic perspective, we understand that when people are aware and comfortable with themselves, even if they're not perfect, because there's no such thing as perfection, that when they are aware, it makes it a lot easier to have grace with other people. It makes it a lot easier to see people. It makes it a lot easier to increase self-awareness for other people, right? It makes it a lot easier to understand how to navigate particular situations so that you can manage properly as opposed to intimidating or as opposed to causing fear. We also know that fear and intimidation are emotions and they're temporary. So you can only cause a person to be fearful for a little time and then the fear dissipates. So if you keep trying to manage through fear, the person is going to get tired because you can't keep managing through fear because fear is temporary. It doesn't last long. So you have to manage through social responsibility and emotional intelligence. So I think the first thing is when people are given power, they have power. We have to also be assessing for their own self-awareness. And then from the assessment of their own self-awareness, assessing how they understand and see people through the use of emotional intelligence. And then we can really give them the power. And maybe there's a couple more steps in there that needs to be addressed as well. But I think self-awareness and emotional intelligence and assessing are the best ways to increase management skills. And increasing management skills means that we have a better use of power.
And so what kind of checks and balances or policies would you put in place to prevent the misuse of power in the workplace?
You know what my answer is already, Ashish, is that everybody needs to have a therapist on site. I wish we had mental health providers in all of these companies. We have budgets for all these things. And sometimes people are completely misusing their budget, but that's a whole nother conversation, right? We don't have to talk about that today.
Well, I mean, I would tell you one thing that I thought about the other day, and so we're actually thinking about building this in the Consciously Unbiased training program. I had asked a bunch of HR and DEI professionals, how does neuroplasticity play into overcoming diversity and inclusion in the workplace? And they're like, oh, wow, I don't even know how to start with that. And I'm like, if you're in that role, you should know these kind of things because like you have to like getting inclusion to happen has to happen from the ground up and like rewiring of people's views, right?
That's right.
And how can you be in that job if you don't have that? And so I feel like corporate America needs that training, especially those empowered to actually help inclusion work better.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think on that?
I mean, absolutely. I think that there's lots of rewiring that we have to do because folks are being raised and socialized to do things improper. And I think part of that has to do with capitalism here in the United States. I think a lot of that has to do with racism. But I think that, and people are afraid to be marginalized because marginalized people are not treated well, right? And so people are aiming so fast to not be in the category of other that they subsequently stop caring about people and become extremely selfish. And so our brains evolve in that particular way. So I love neuroplasticity. I love when we think about it from a mental health perspective. It would be ideal for everybody that's in DEI to have a background in mental health and to be able to have access to continued professional development and continued education so that they can stay abreast on the information because there's so much research that's consistently coming out, especially now as mental health is becoming a bit more normalized. So there's a lot more research around it.
So can you define neuroplasticity for those who don't know what it is?
Oh God, I don't know the when I think of neuroplasticity, maybe that's the best way I could think about it. I think about being able to stretch and flex and pivot. So stretch, flex, and pivot. So our brains are wired in particular ways through reinforcement, through chemicals that are in our brain, through environment. It's like creating a road, right? And so we lay the concrete and the concrete dries. That's the reinforcement. And we keep laying the concrete and we keep going another way. Neuroplasticity allows for there to be a backing of that a little bit and more roads to be created. So there's more options for people. There's more lanes. There's more roads that people can take. And so it's around flexibility in the brain, right? Flexibility, recognizing that maybe you went too far with laying concrete down and you need to back up a little bit and go in a different direction and things like that. So when I think about neuroplasticity and I'm talking about it with my clients, we're talking about flexibility and the creation of new pathways in the brain.
So that, for me on the corporate side, that's like, how do we teach people to be unstuck or think differently, right? So if I'm always thinking that women can't be good at tech, and then I realize that that's not true, so I'm going to take that different road down this different path instead of keep going to this narrow thing that I'm going through, right?
Yeah, in my team at the university, a lot of us are women, and we have somebody on the team who said something ridiculously stupid the other day around women's limitations, and we all looked at him like, "Aren't you a daggone counselor? Like, how the hell did you say something so ridiculous?" Right? But we got problems with him anyway. But I think that socialization creates these ideas and they're reinforced over time and through environment. And so people get stuck in those particular ways. The same with power, right? Like we think about how power is misused from generation to generation. I remember having a conversation with some of my friends that were in my book club a few years ago. And we were saying about how some of these young guys will rape women in college and they think it's okay. And in fact, we could take the Murdoch case that just happened, where people will misuse a young child, an adolescent will misuse power, and they think it's okay because somebody else misused power and told them that it was okay. And then the previous generation misused power and told that generation it was okay. So we have generations of the misuse of power. And then it lands on someone and they're like, well, why was I bad? What was wrong with me in making that decision? Hell yeah, it's privilege. Yes, it's privilege. The fact that they keep getting away with it for generation after generation is part of privilege too. And that people have access to be able to protect people who should not be protected. And that is also the privilege of policing in this country that you started off with and talking about the unions and things like that. Like people are willing to kill in those situations because they think that it's okay. And they think that they're going to be protected in those ways versus some other countries where all you have is a baton, right? Like you're not about, and it's a lot harder to kill someone with a baton, not to say it can't happen, but it's a lot harder than a gun where you only have one shot that can do it. I think somebody go ahead. Sorry.
Are you saying privilege is not really that good for you over the long term because eventually it's going to get you? Right, because you think about like the Murdoch stuff, they've had 7 generations of privilege, and eventually that ended up in jail and death, right? And it's because they didn't know how to. Like it ends up becoming a cancer in your body.
Yeah, I think that question is tricky, Ashish, and this is why I love talking to you. I don't think that privilege is necessarily a bad thing either. I think it's the misuse of privilege, just like there's a misuse of power. There are, I think about the civil rights movement, and, a lot of folks will be like, well, the civil rights movement, because Black people were fighting and all of those things. And 100%, my elders and ancestors, they were fighting. And Ashish, your elders and ancestors were probably fighting too, right? But we needed white people in there too. And you remember we did a talk a few years ago, you and I, and there were some other people on the panel talking about accomplices versus allies, right? Yeah. We need people in the civil rights. We needed white people who had privilege, who had a seat at the table, who had access to power changers and move makers, right? We needed them. Those people used their privilege and their power in a beautiful way to help other people. So privilege in itself isn't a bad thing, and power in itself isn't a bad thing. It's the misuse of it that becomes bad. So in the case with Murdoch, I think is how you say their name, they absolutely misused their privilege. And then they misused their power. And it resulted in deaths, many deaths, as a matter of fact. And I think that it's not just physical death. Those are physical deaths, but it's not just physical death. It's emotional death too. I think about how the misuse of power can cause people to get anxious to go to work, can cause people to question their purpose. It can cause people to not be productive or do the things that they were designed to do or do the things that they love to do, all because of one misuse of power. And that is problematic, as opposed to the proper use of power, which motivates people and encourages people and allows for alignment and allows for the amplification of purpose when it's done right. And it's done right because those leaders or those people with power are paying attention and they care. And they're not in it for the ego. They're in it for the ability to have good, healthy dynamics and power with people.
So I'm going to leave you with one last thought, and I want to go on to the next question. But so privilege without curiosity leads to blind spots and is detrimental, I think, overall.
Ooh, yeah, privilege. Oh, that's tweetable. That
Right.
privilege. Say that again, Ashish.
Privilege without curiosity is detrimental to your own.
Yeah, privilege without curiosity is detrimental. That is true. Oh yeah, that's good. I wish I had Twitter, but I don't. Maybe I'm gonna put it on Instagram. I'm gonna give you credit though, Ashish. I believe in citing people.
So let's go back to the corporate workplace and misuse of power. So fear keeps people from speaking up, right? And what does it look like to be an effective bystander?
Yeah, I was talking to some folks about this. I told you I get to do this public speaking work, and we were talking about the power of bystanders because there's usually more bystanders in a dynamic than there is a bully and there is a victim, right? There's usually one or two bullies, a couple victims, but there's a lot of bystanders. And that's where, again, we get to talk about privilege. I think what holds people back, like we talked about, is this fear. And fear is temporary, but fear is temporary because it's an emotion. But emotions can be reinforced that then make a person believe that it's logic, right? And so they'll keep making a rationale around an emotion when it's not supposed to be that particular way. So what I would love for bystanders to do is to just spend time with their own courage and understanding that in that courage is where we're going to see some action, right? And action doesn't always mean that you have to be confrontational. It doesn't mean you always have to say something in that moment. There are other ways that you can be a bystander. There are other ways you can overcome that fear. There are other ways that you could get the outcome that you want. Everybody doesn't have to be in confrontation. And I think that is causing problems for people too, because they're like, well, if I don't confront it head on, then it means that, what does that mean for me? And so I often tell people you can be a bystander in different type of ways. You can be a bystander by doing direct confrontation, but you can also be a bystander by writing letters. You can be a bystander by adjusting policy. You can be a bystander by simply having a conversation with somebody else, and then you guys unifying and becoming a team of 2 and a team of 3 and a team of 4. And as you all get more numbers, then maybe you have more courage and more influence in that way too. But I think the biggest thing is that people are afraid, and they're afraid of being pushed off to the side and being marginalized. So many bystanders stay quiet because they are afraid of becoming the victim. And that's problematic.
So here's an example.
Retaliation.
Here's an example of a way you can not be a passive aggressive bully as a bystander. So let's say I said a racist joke towards you, or I said a sexist joke towards you, and it's you and me talking, and there's like 20 other people in the room, and then they laugh, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they just didn't laugh, that would send a signal to me that that's not cool.
That's right.
Right. And that's a way to like be a proactive bystander.
That's right. That's right.
Aggressive bully.
That's right. That's right. Which is an action, right? Which is an action. And it doesn't mean that I have to say in that moment, Ashish, that was racist. Why did you say that? Right? Like I may not have to do that. I could just
not laugh.
And that's it, right? But again, I think people are afraid of that being turned on them. But because there's more bystanders in general, there's more bystanders than there are bullies and victims. The bystanders have more power than the victim, or excuse me, the bystander has more power than the bully, always. They just don't necessarily see that because their fear overshadows that. And again, fear has a lot of different responses, right? Like we're most familiar with fight or flight, and now there's the freeze in there that's also being introduced. But fear is an emotion that is also temporary. I think, again, a lot of people make decisions off of temporary emotions, and that is not healthy. And we find ourselves in some very tough situations because of that. So if people just sit back for a second and acknowledge that they have an emotion and then wait until that emotion kind of dies down, the intensity dies down, to then make a decision, I think we will find ourselves being much better as individuals in work, as citizens in society, as parents, as educators, and so much more.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, so Holly's probably going to kill me because we basically really went off script and really went into the psychological part of this, but.
What? Hey, Holly!
And so, but she was also worried that we wouldn't take enough time, and that clearly we can clearly open mic this.
Right. So, Holly should know better at this point. She know when you and I get together, we just keep on going. She's probably going to send me a message like, hey, Dr. Plummer, slow down a little bit. Hey, Holly.
Thank you so much for doing this. I wanted to ask you one last thing. So you know about our microprogressions, right? They're active steps to help the workplace be more positive, inclusive, and so what's we call them microprogressions, right? And so what's one action step that each of us can use to be a change maker in your view?
I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier, self-awareness. I think the more we are aware of ourselves, then we create space for other people. And the more we give grace to ourselves in that we're not perfect, the more grace we can give to other people. And the more we understand what we don't know, then we can lean into learning. And we can also accept when other people don't know and don't be so frustrated and disappointed in them. So I think it's really a matter of sitting and increasing our own self-awareness. And in doing that, we become better individuals, and then we become better community members.
Absolutely. And you just inspired me to think of one more microprogression. Okay. You said frustration, which is key, right? So I think in times that we're frustrated because we think something's happening to us, or the reaction of somebody doing something to us, or somebody didn't follow us in the workplace properly, just realize that that decision had 99%, you weren't a factor in it, right? Yeah. And if you understand it's not about you and it's just something somebody did in their mind, then I think you can be less frustrated about it and handle it in a better way. Right. Yeah. So like my actions aren't about you, even if they might have irritated you. You weren't in my thought process at all. So if we realize that, then I think we're better equipped to handle those situations.
I think that can happen in a lot of situations, Ashish, but I also think that some people do factor in somebody else in their decisions, and it's not always positive, right? Yeah. I do know that the position I stand in as a Black woman, there are times when people are being intentionally harmful to me, but they know how to play words or situations to make it so that when they get confronted, they're like, oh, that's not the case. Mm. But to your point, a lot of times we are overly sensitive and certain things are really not about us, right? Yeah. Like certain things are because a person is moving too fast I wish one day, and and I feel like a magician. I know if I wish it out loud on this day, this manifestation day, then it's going to come true. But I wish one day we could spend some time talking about the emotional escalation curve as well. It's like a bell curve, and it goes into the idea around self-awareness. A person is likely to get an emotion after they've been triggered. As it relates to that curve. Yeah. So if I get frustrated, it is usually because I've been triggered in something, but most people don't know what their triggers are. And so subsequently they will blame or project it onto somebody else as opposed to highlighting that this is a sensitive spot for them. So positions like being excluded or not being thought about in a particular decision can be a trigger for people. Like, why didn't you think about me? Why didn't you consider me? And that makes me frustrated. Is it because I'm invisible? Whatever the case may be. So I do think that both are true. Many decisions are not about a person, an individual person. And we still get frustrated because we don't know our own emotional escalation curve. And some decisions are just because we are very sensitive about something. And some things are true in that people are trying to hurt us and harm us for whatever their reasons are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so let's do that. So when do you want to do that?
Oh, you know me. I will make time. I will make time. Don't let me hit up Jess and Shahida right now. Like, listen, me and Ashish are going to talk again about emotional escalation. But I think the sooner the better, Ashish. Okay. I do think that goes into this idea of self-awareness. So if you and I are sitting here talking for almost an hour, we're like, people have to be self-aware. People have to be self-aware. One of the things they have to be aware about is their emotions. And most people don't know their emotions. I'll talk to grown adults and they'll be like, oh, the emotions I know are mad. And that's not a real emotion, by the way, but mad and sad and happy, maybe excited, maybe confused, maybe frustrated, but they don't lean into like all these other emotions that are there. And so subsequently they're making lifelong decisions off of 3 or 6 emotions.
Oh, 100%. Like, we're taught, well, especially as men, we're taught to suppress our feelings, right? The first time I remember this distinctly, the first time somebody asked me to write about what I'm feeling, I took a pen, and I'm not used to writing because I haven't written in like 20 years. I took a pen and started writing. And the act of like connecting my mind physically with actually writing it down hurt my wrist because I was putting so much pressure on the pen because I'm not used to feeling. Right? Yeah. So I think it's a powerful way to do that. So I think maybe we should start a series called Know Thyself.
Let's do it. Ashish, you're speaking my language again. I am all the way down for that. Know thyself. And again, when we spend time, one of the things I know we got to end up in soon before Holly, sends us a message. But one of the things that I often talk about in this self-awareness journey is that we will spend time learning everything else, studying everything else. I have a doctorate. I've been in education and school for so long, right? I love it. I love it though. I'm a nerd, right? 100%. But I've spent years studying mental health, years studying criminology, years studying being a parent, years now that I've been married for a number of years what it means to be a spouse, years in what it means to be a CEO of a company, years. How much of that time do we actually spend studying ourselves, right? Exactly, Ashish. People are experts on all these topics, will write all of these books about all of these things, do all of these speaking engagements, and don't even know themselves. People will go and be educators and don't know themselves. In this case, they'll be police officers with the misuse of power and don't know themselves. But we'll spend all the time studying everything else. In fact, we'll pay universities so that we could be a student there to study a topic and won't study ourselves for free. And I said, what happens if we only spend a small bit of that time, that same exact quantifiable time studying ourselves? 15 minutes a day. What were my triggers today? What were the highlights of my day? What motivated me today? Where was I sensitive today? What were a series of my thoughts today? How did those thoughts lead to action? Like truly just studying ourselves, right? I wish we would spend more time studying ourselves, intentional, quantitative time. So let's do it, Ashish. I'm down.
All right, cool. I really enjoyed this. This is amazing. And maybe we'll get people to stop spending $1 trillion on avoiding themselves.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much.
Onyx, baby, if you come to Onyx, you're gonna study yourself. So
exactly. All right. Well, this was amazing. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and thank you so much for doing this today with us. And it was so insightful, and I'm so honored that you're gonna be part of our team.
Absolutely, Ashish. Thanks for choosing me. Thanks for having this conversation with me. And thanks for allowing me to join the board. Oh, we're about to make some extra magic happen. So thank you, Ashish.
All right. Thank you.
All right. See you. Bye.